Chapter 5. Sapphire had put some kind of snack meal together for the two children. Helen was then put to bed. When Rob peeped into the spare room an hour or so later, long after the clocks had all been rewound once more, he found his sister fast asleep. Sapphire was alone in the kitchen when Rob returned. The hob lid of the stove was open, and Sapphire was burning the nursery rhyme book, dropping the pages a few at a time into the flames. It was as Rob closed the kitchen door behind him and was about to tell Sapphire that Helen was sound asleep that he realised. He stopped and stared across the room. When Sapphire and Steel had arrived at the house earlier that evening, they had carried not one bag or suitcase between them. Yet now Sapphire was standing by the stove, and she was dressed in a completely different outfit. Rob looked hard at her. Even her hairstyle had changed. She looked, to Rob, like a woman he had once seen in an old 19th century picture. Sapphire looked around at him, noticed his stare, then realised. "Oh," she gave him the smile. "I suppose I've surprised you." "Well," Rob began, still puzzled. "Only I fancied a change," said Sapphire, turning back to the stove. "Steel complains now and again," she added as she dropped more pages into the open hob of the stove. Rob moved slowly across the room, still staring at her. "He says I shouldn't use time as if it's some kind of wardrobe." She broke the back cover of the book and dropped the pieces into the fire. "But he's so serious, and I get bored wearing the same—" "But where did you get them?" Rob was still staring at her. "What?" asked Sapphire innocently, as she poked pieces of book down into the stove. "The clothes." "Oh," she smiled. "They're not real. These ones aren't real." "Not real?" "No." Sapphire set the poker down and dropped the last few pieces of book into the open hob. "Look." Rob looked. "These were a favourite of mine last week." Rob was still looking at Sapphire as her outfit changed yet again. This time it was a 1940s style. Clothes, shoes, hair, makeup, everything. And Rob, although he could not understand, accepted it totally and without question. Whoever she was, whatever she was, he knew deep inside himself somewhere that he accepted Sapphire. He also knew then that this complete acceptance that could not be accounted for would be with him for the rest of his life. Perhaps he could not trust her. He was not sure of this now, but somehow it did not seem to matter. Whatever the cost to come, he accepted her and believed in her at that moment in time. And, as his mind and his soul and his body told him this, he found that he was looking into her eyes and beyond them. It was only a glimpse, a hint. It was as if those eyes were clear blue shutters that were capable of opening and showing him times and worlds that he had never seen and never would see. "So what do you think, Rob?" She turned to show him the complete effect of the outfit, and the moment passed. "I think that it's—" Rob tried to put the right words together. "I just think that—" "What?" asked Sapphire. "That— well, I just think that you're beautiful." "Thank you," said Sapphire. She put the hob lid back on the stove, and the glow from the fire was shut in. So, too, were the images that Rob had seen in her face. "The corridor thing, have you ever seen it?" asked Rob, trying to keep the fascination going. "Not properly," Sapphire replied, as she placed the poker back at the side of the stove. "It's both difficult and dangerous to see. Time always is. You can't go backwards into time to look, or forwards." "Then how can you see it?" "You see it when it breaks in, of course." And she seemed a little tired of the explanation as she moved to the sink to wash her hands. Rob moved to help her. He turned on the tap and handed her some soap and a towel. "We had this assignment once," said Sapphire. "Assignment?" Sapphire nodded as she washed her long, sensitive-looking hands. "On a ship, of all things." "A ship?" Rob pursued it, intrigued. "Yes. Time breaking through in the middle of the ocean, would you believe?" She took the towel from Rob. "Thank you." "And is this—" Rob began. Sapphire looked at him. "Is this, well, you being here, is this also an assignment?" Before she could answer him, Steel had appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He watched them. "Sorry," said Sapphire to Steel. And, during the fraction of a second that it took to return the towel to Rob, she was back in her original clothes. Steel walked slowly into the room. "Perhaps when you've finished telling the boy all about the nicer aspects of our job," there was an edge to Steel's voice, "you'll also tell him about the dangers." "He knows about them," Sapphire replied. "Enough about them. Enough about the dangers in this house." Sapphire said nothing as Steel walked slowly to Rob and stared at him for a moment or so. "This corridor, it's immense," said Steel, "so don't try to imagine it." "No," said Rob. "Because time is immense." Steel held up finger and thumb, indicating a measure. "So try to imagine instead, if you're capable of it, mankind, or the existence of mankind, as approximately 1 inch in length." Rob nodded as Steel placed his finger and thumb approximately 1 inch away from the boy's face. "Then compare it with this corridor called time, which is, say, 1,000 million miles long." Rob tried to focus on the finger and thumb that were held close to his face. "Mankind, 1 inch," Steel continued. "Time and the unknown, 1,000 million miles. Just compare them. Got it?" "Yes, I think so," lied Rob. "Good." Steel removed his hand. "Because I think you've already witnessed a fraction of those dangers this evening, whether you recognise them as dangers or not." Steel pointed. "Upstairs." "Oh, I realise," Rob began to say. "Because some things have access to that so-called corridor." Steel began to cross the room as if he had finished what he had to say. He began to check the clocks. "Things?" Rob asked nervously. Steel turned to look at Rob once more. "Yes, things." "What kind of things?" asked Rob. "Things." He said the word again, making it sound even more sinister. "Things from the very beginnings of time, or things from the very end of time. Take your pick." Rob looked at Sapphire, then back to Steel. "And these things are in that corridor?" Rob half-whispered the question. Steel nodded. "Forever moving along it, backwards and forwards." The fear inside Rob was sudden and sharp like a pain. It was a fear for his parents that was not helped by the jumbled thoughts in his head. And he found that his mind seemed to be confused by the bright magic of Sapphire and the cold logic of Steel. He could hear the man's words through the mild chaos of his thoughts and feelings. "And they move to and fro in that corridor." Steel's voice continued with its warning, with its threat. "Ever looking, ever searching. Always trying to find a way in, trying to find a way through the fabric." Helen could not sleep properly. The events of the evening and being put to bed in a strange room probably caused the unrest. And so she awoke, reached for her teddy bear doll, then climbed out of bed. She opened the door of the spare bedroom, then, dressed only in her nightgown, she moved out onto the landing. She thought at first that she might go downstairs. She could hear Rob, Steel and Sapphire talking in the kitchen below. But in her young mind there was time to see them later, time enough to talk to them afterwards. Helen moved to the cupboard stair door and opened it. She peered up towards the dark attic landing. "Look for Mama and Daddy, shall we, Becca?" she asked the doll. She rocked the doll in her arms, then looked up at the landing once more. "See the pretty pictures again, shall we?" And she made the teddy bear doll nod its head in answer. Still cradling the doll, Helen began to climb the steep, dark stairs to the attic above. But what made them come in? Rob was still trying to get things straight, still trying to understand it all in his mind. "What made the things choose this house?" he asked. "Why our home?" "We've already explained that to you," said Steel. "The fabric is here. The echoes of the past, all the right or wrong ingredients are here in this house. Therefore the pressure point was here." "Upstairs in Helen's room?" said Rob. Steel nodded. "But we've stopped them. We've held them. We've destroyed the final echo. The last ingredient. The trigger." "The trigger?" whispered Rob. "Yes," said Sapphire, and pointed to the stove. "You watched me burn it, didn't you?" "I watched you burn the book, yes. Was that the trigger?" "Not quite," said Sapphire. "But one particular line was. The next line. The line that Steel prevented me from saying, remember?" And Rob remembered the rhyme read aloud, and the wall that pushed outwards, and the terrible sound. "Yes, of course I remember." "Well, that was the trigger." Sapphire was looking at Rob steadily. "One particular line from one particular nursery rhyme said aloud in one particular room. Helen's room." Helen had opened the door of her bedroom, and she had switched on the bedside lamp. She now knelt upon the bed, the teddy bear doll cradled upon her knees. She did not miss the book because she had a good memory for her age, and therefore knew her favourite nursery rhyme by heart. Every last word and letter of it. Helen began to swing the doll to and fro as she chanted the rhyme. "Ring of roses, a pocket full of posies." In the kitchen, the wall clock stopped first. Steel had already hurried across the room. He dragged open the hallway door as the second clock stopped. The hallway clocks also ceased their ticking, first one, then the other, as Steel ran to the foot of the first flight of stairs. Steel was looking up at the landing above, listening for something, as Sapphire and Rob hurried along the hallway to join him. They could just hear from the very top of the house the faint sound of Helen's voice as she recited the rhyme. "The king has sent his daughter." As the child's chanting voice floated down to them from the attic room, Steel, Sapphire and Rob were already running up the first flight of stairs. By the time they had reached the first landing, Helen's voice could be heard more clearly. "To fetch her—" The child seemed to have forgotten the sequence. Steel, Sapphire and Rob had crossed the landing and were climbing the second flight of stairs as Helen remembered. "To fetch a pail of water, a tissue, a tissue." They heard the rushing, rumbling sound as they reached the second-floor landing. And, as they clambered quickly up the steep attic stairs, the sound had already increased and was growing even louder. "The bird upon the steeple, Helen!" Rob found himself shouting as Steel shoved open the door of the attic room. "Sits high above the people." And Helen was there in the room, cradling the doll, her face reflecting the light that was already spilling from the wall. The light breeze blew through the room, and the jumbled, restless shapes were there, like a part of the radiant light. But the shapes moved faster now, so that the wall was beginning to lose its natural form. To Rob, it no longer resembled a wall. It was like a lot of different places somewhere else, a lot of voices, a lot of people, a madness, a confusion. It was, to him, like the worst of the cold, feverish dreams that you woke screaming from during an illness. The most disturbing nightmare snatched from sickness and thrust forward and magnified 1,000 times. As the sound grew to a high pulsating screech that seemed to cut through the ears and the skull and the nerves, Rob found that he could not look away from this tumbling mass of light and noise. It appeared to be advancing into the room, advancing towards him, gaining ground and space as it spread itself, so that the room appeared to be proportionately smaller. It was as if the attic bedroom was being absorbed, as if the shifting, growing light was soaking up all that was real and sane and safe, and above it all was the terrible tearing sound. "Hold her! Hold the child!" Steele's voice seemed as faint as a voice in a storm. "It's too late to say the rhyme back. Just hold the child!" Then, among the shapes and half-seen figures that moved within the area of light, Rob saw the shadow of his mother. He recognized her by the slow, easy way she walked, like someone who was never in any hurry. She was moving towards him. She then disappeared and reappeared again further back among the shapes, moving forward once more, but smaller in perspective, as if the mass of light had a depth of its own. Then she was gone again. To Rob, it was like watching a distant swimmer on a hot day, when the sky and sea and haze merge with equal brightness. He thought, too, that he heard her voice under the shrill sound. On impulse, he pressed his hands hard against his ears and stumbled towards the area of light. He felt himself grabbed and dragged backwards suddenly and violently. Steele jerked Rob towards the open doorway, then released him. Rob felt a gentler hand take him by the shoulder. It was Sapphire. She was standing outside the door and holding Helen close to her. The area of light, the moving, shifting mass that was once a wall, now filled the room and was spreading towards them and the open door, throwing out its reflecting light as it moved. Steele reached out again. This time he snatched the doll from Helen's hands. Before she could cry out in protest, Steele had leaned forward and tossed the doll into the centre of the light source. The teddy bear doll did not complete its journey through the air. It did not fall to the floor. Rob saw it reach the area of light. There was a grabbing, snatching sound, and the doll disappeared. It seemed to be sucked into the mass of light. Steele pulled the door to and slammed it shut for the second time that evening. From inside the room the sound died, like something that had been switched off. But the glow flickered around the edges of the door for a few moments. Then that also died. A good 3 minutes seemed to pass before Steele was satisfied enough to turn from the closed door. He ignored Helen crying for her lost doll. Instead, he looked at Rob. How many more rhymes has she memorized? "I don't know," said Rob. It was the truth. Steele looked down at Helen, and Helen looked back up at him, still crying as she held on tightly to Sapphire. "Keep her with you at all times." Sapphire nodded, and Steele looked at Rob once more as the crying continued. "Has she other dolls?" "Yes." "Then find her one," was Steele's only offering as he moved towards the stairs. The way that doll disappeared, Rob had to ask the question. Is that the way my mother and father..." "Yes." Steele stopped halfway down the stairs. "And you almost went the same way." Rob looked at the closed door of the attic room. It was still quiet, and the glow from inside the room was still extinguished. So, from now on and until I say differently, this floor is out of bounds," said Steel as he moved on down to the bottom of the stairs. "But my mother's still in that room." Steel's reply came from the landing below. "Not any more." And his footsteps could be heard as he began to descend the second flight of stairs. Rob turned slowly to find Sapphire looking at him. "But I saw her," he insisted. "I saw her in the room." Sapphire shook her head. "I did. I heard her voice." He remembered the strange light and the shadowy figures and that one familiar figure, half seen, only half recognised. And he found now, out here on the comparatively normal, peaceful landing, that he was not completely sure of what he had seen, or what the strange light had wanted him to see. "It wasn't her?" he asked, tentatively. Sapphire shook her head once more. Rob held her gaze for a moment, then had to look away quickly. Helen's crying had stopped, but Rob felt tears inside himself. His throat was tight as he tried hard to fight the choked, helpless sensation. He had to fight it. He had no intention of breaking down in front of his sister and this woman called Sapphire. He did not trust her or Steel, not completely. He accepted her, and he was fascinated by her, but he could not trust her. Not yet. And, because of the young and therefore strange feelings that he had for her, she would be the last person to see him weep. Perhaps later, in the privacy of his own room and in his own bed, he would allow himself the painful but necessary luxury of crying. "Mama's coming home?" Rob realised that Helen was talking to him. He reached out and touched her, brushed her hair with his fingers. "Not yet," he answered. "Soon?" Rob looked up at Sapphire, and Sapphire nodded. "Yes," said Rob to his sister, as Sapphire led them down the dark stairs. "Soon."